Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to BBC News. As the prospect of military action against Syria remains on the table, tensions in the region have increased with a joint missile test by Israel and the United States in the eastern Mediterranean. The missile launch was detected this morning by a Russian early warning system in Armavir in the south of Russia. It reported an object moving from the central part of the Mediterranean Sea towards the coast in the east, which includes Syria. Israel says it used an Arrow missile, similar to this, to bring down a target missile as part of a test of its air defences. Well, also today, the United Nations Refugee Agency said more than 2 million people have now fled Syria, and half of them are thought to be children. Our Middle East correspondent, Jim Muir, reports.
Omran al-Masri fled from his home in Syria with his wife and their 5 children more than a year ago. He says, at least we can sleep here. We couldn't in Syria. We saw terrible things. Since then, they've been living here at Zahri camp in Jordan, the second biggest refugee settlement in the whole world. Life isn't easy, cooped up in the camp. But at least there's shelter and food. 2/3 of the refugees are living outside the camps, making it harder for the aid agencies to help cope with the massive challenge.
Things are accelerating in a way that represents not only a dramatic humanitarian problem for the people, not only the refugees, those displaced inside Syria, more than 4 million, the whole Syrian population, but it's also a major threat for peace and security in the region and in the world.
The UN says around 5,000 more refugees are crossing Syria's borders every single day. Lebanon, the smallest of Syria's neighbours, has taken in the most, absorbing over 700,000 Syrian refugees. To the south, more than 500,000 have crossed the border into Jordan, while up in the north, more than 450,000 have fled to Turkey to escape the conflict. The latest focus is in northern Iraq. A sudden rush of mainly Kurdish Syrian refugees began flooding across the border last month. It was the most concentrated influx so far. The relief agencies had to set up new camps to try to absorb the arrivals. More than half of all the 2 million registered refugees are children. They've been called the lost generation. Just to give them a basic education will be a huge challenge, and nobody can tell them when they might be able to go home.
That's Jim Muir. We will be at a refugee camp in the next few minutes. But first, as you can see, let's go straight to Washington, D.C. Our correspondent Jane O'Brien is following developments there. And Jane, tell us more, give us a sense of what's being said about this apparent joint Israel-US manoeuvre.
Well, so far we've had no confirmation from the Obama administration that this happened. All the information we have at the moment is coming from the Israeli Ministry of Defense, and they have confirmed that a missile launch took place in the Mediterranean and that it was a joint exercise conducted with the US. But according to reports in the Israeli media, this was primarily a defense system that was being tested, known as the Sparrow. And this is a missile that is usually shot from a plane, and it's used to track ground-to-ground missiles such as Scuds or cruise missiles, with a view to directing anti-missile defense systems to track them and shoot them down. So, as I said, no confirmation at the moment from the US. All the information so far is coming out of Israel.
But is the sense in the United States that this is America, the administration in some way, pointing up the regional implications of what is going on in Syria as he looks ahead to Congress reconvening next week?
Well, clearly any form of test of this nature is going to be seen through the lens of Syria, and it's certainly, one would assume, within Israel's best interest to show that it has this type of sophisticated defense system and that it is acting in concert with the US. It also comes ahead of a meeting today with the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, where senior administration figures, including the Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel and the Secretary of State John Kerry and America's top commander Martin Dempsey, will be making the case for action in front of senior lawmakers. Now, that meeting will be held in public because it's as much as about convincing the American people as it is convincing Congress that some sort of military action is required. So again, we're going to see another day of the Obama administration putting out its case, justifying some sort of military action in the coming weeks.
Yes, and you talk about convincing the public as well. Just remind us, Jane, give us a sense of where public opinion stands in this matter at the moment, just as we're getting comments from, for example, Senator John McCain suggesting that it looks like the administration might be prepared to do rather more than perhaps we all thought a few days ago.
Well, that's coming from John McCain.
Yes.
He of course, has been very hawkish on this issue right from the word go. He was an early advocate of arming the rebels, which the administration has since started to do in a very limited fashion. But the decision still remains primarily with the president. He says he has not made up his mind what he's going to do. He is seeking congressional approval, and he is adamant that this will be a limited strike, a limited engagement, because the last thing the American public wants to see right now is another protracted involvement in an open-ended conflict in the Middle East. There's also a big question about the cost and what the policy objectives would be. Is it to topple the Assad regime? Is it to send a shot across his bows, as it's been phrased? Or is there some wider implication with Middle East policy? But one thing is for certain, that the president has no good options at the moment, and that's one of the reasons why he's seeking approval from Congress.
Yes, all right. Thanks very much. Jane O'Brien with the latest there in Washington, D.C. Thank you. 12 minutes past 2. Let's return to very much our main story, events in Syria and surrounding areas, of course, because we brought you that report at the top of the hour about the increasing number of refugees, now topping that really grim total of more than 2 million refugees as a result of the 2.5 years of fighting in Syria. Let's return to our Middle East correspondent Jim Muir, because he is at a refugee camp in Akkar in the north of Lebanon, and a relatively small country, Jim, that is taking in an awful lot of people.
That's absolutely right. I have to say, though, that there's no refugee camps as such in Lebanon. Lebanon is very wary of allowing people to set up formal camps, because they've had Palestinian refugees camped here since 1948, and they don't want to see that kind of permanence happening again. So behind me here, for example, you can see what is the fate of many Syrian refugees. They're basically squatting in unfinished buildings, shops, garages, and so on. And that's the same picture. This is one small community up in the north, very close to the Syrian border here. But all over the country, there are hundreds and hundreds of municipalities who've taken in small communities like this and are giving them shelter one way or another. Now, life isn't easy for these refugees. They're having to pay rent, even for those unfinished garages and so on. Something like $100, $150 a month, which is quite a lot of money for if you haven't got any and you have no way of making money. There are health issues. There's a lot of damp there. The children, quite a lot of them have got skin problems starting to develop. But a number of them are going to local schools, which is encouraging, because, of course, the disruption of education for the children, who make up more than half of the estimated 700,000 registered refugees here in Lebanon. Everybody knows that's a very conservative figure, because in fact there's probably well over 1 million, because quite a lot are not registered. So it is a fantastically huge burden for the country that is least capable really of bearing that burden. It's a very small country, Lebanon. It's very fragile. It's very fractured itself. And, of course, it has no real government at the moment. The government's in a state of resignation. So the heaviest burden, in a way, is falling on the country least able to cope with it. And it is a fantastic challenge for the Lebanese, and indeed for all the NGOs trying to help these refugees here.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, a desperate situation, of course, for the refugees themselves. But interesting that you use the word resignation, Jim. I mean, what sense have you been able to get from local people as to how they feel about this influx, despite the obvious human sympathy? I'm also curious how they feel about this on a practical day-to-day level.
Well, just spending the last few hours here with quite a mix of a lot of Syrian kids, obviously, but also a quite large number of Lebanese children and young men and others who all seem to be pulling together and helping them. It's really quite heartening. But some communities, especially in more tightly geographically squeezed areas, valleys and so on, they are pretty much super saturated They were very welcoming at the beginning because there are a lot of family ties, a lot of toing and froing. A lot of the areas here on this remote border zone were living off smuggling, going back and forward across the border. So there's a lot of interaction, and the initial reaction was to welcome them, to bring them into homes and so on. But as the months went on and the years started to accumulate, that burden has become really big, and you sense there is a kind of saturation that has been reached, the point where services, electricity, water, etc., schooling, it's a real stress on the Lebanese. And of course there's also the business of jobs, because Syrians are willing to work for very, very little just to have some money, and that is to some extent taking jobs away from local people. So there is a little bit of resentment starting to build up, and that is why UN officials and others have warned that this is not just a humanitarian problem, it is potentially a big security problem, not just for Lebanon, of course, but for the whole region.
Yes, all right, thank you very much. Jim Muir in Lebanon, thanks very much.
Let's turn to our main headlines here this afternoon. Israel says it's conducted a joint missile test with America over the Mediterranean to try out its air defences.